A Vanishing Dream, a new Swan dramaturgical feature, written and narrated by Neah Lekan. It seemed as if, at last, our dreams were coming true. Yet now our daily physical torture, confusion of mind, gradual wearing down of courage, seemed to make that long-continued hope look like a vanishing dream. For we are in the worst of that dust storm area where William Vaughn Moody's expression, dust to eat, is not merely a figure of speech, but the phrasing of a bitter reality. Any attempt to suggest the violent discomfort of these storms is likely to be in vain, except to those who have already experienced them. Caroline Henderson, 1935. Dear patrons of the New Swan Theatre, thank you so very much for attending our 2026 production of Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare. My name is Neah Lekan, dramaturg of Romeo and Juliet and Education and Engagement Associate at the New Swan Shakespeare Centre, and it's my honor to present to you this fresh experiment in Swan educational programming, the Show Companion podcast. In this audio documentary, A Vanishing Dream, I narrate in 140 minutes the story of a region, an ecological crisis, and the New Swan production they inspired. This is the tale of the Dust Bowl, the most devastating artificial ecological disaster in human history, and one that remains resonant for us almost a century later here in Southern California. Almost 100 years ago now, in 1932, storms sometimes hundreds of miles across, filled with the topsoil from all over the western plains of North America, blanketed the earth in dirt that once held the dreams of thousands of migrants, not only from North America but also from Europe and beyond. It was, in no uncertain terms, a calamity, and it tested the faith and hope of those generations of the downtrodden who had sought a land of their own on these prairies. But this is not only a tale of sufferance, it is a story of survival and revival in a land that seemed to be forsaking these next-year people who called it home. It contains some of the most human acts of love, courage, and sacrifice that I have ever encountered as an historian. I am confident that the endurance, the faith, and the assurance of these benighted souls amidst this crisis will prove an inspiration to you, just as it has proven for myself and for the cast and crew of our production of R&J. Amidst the vanishing of their lifelong dreams, these people carried on, whether along roads to California or, in the case of so many, by remaining on the land that was all they had and all they knew. For those who stuck it out, for those who kept the faith, and for those for whom the land, this land, was the last best hope of salvation, I narrate this story unto you. For it is my hope that after watching our show, you will come to know these Dust Bowl stories just as well as you know Shakespeare's, and see how the two, for our director Rachael and myself, have become inextricably connected over the last year of working on this project. I tell this story for Louise Walton and Jean Clark of Lamar, Colorado, for Caroline, Will, and Eleanor Henderson of Texas County, Oklahoma, for Juan Cruz and Virginia Lujan of Cimarron County, Oklahoma, for Bam and Melt White of Dalhart, Texas, for Lauren Svobda of Meade County, Kansas, and for all those survivors and inheritors of the Dust Bowl whom I encountered and shared the land with, knowingly and unknowingly, in my own youngest years in Oklahoma. These people touched us as a company. It is no exaggeration to say that meeting them through the medium of their words enriched us beyond conception. I hope you find, as the story unfolds, many echoes of what you saw on the New Swan stage in these harrowing and yet profoundly inspirational episodes of humanity. On behalf of our brilliant director, Rachael VanWormer, and our entire fantastic company, welcome to the show after the show, where the world so expertly and carefully crafted becomes visible like a rainbow in all its component colors. This tale of last chancers and star-crossed lovers is one, as Ben Jonson said of Shakespeare, not of an age, but for all time. We hope the Swan, our theatre, will continue to be just that, with your love and support. Neah Lekan, Irvine, California, June 2026. Part 1. The Great American Desert, 1610 to 1880. I was born upon the prairie, where the wind blew free and there was nothing to break the light of the sun. I was born where there were no enclosures and where everything drew free breath. I want to die there, not within walls. I know every stream and every wood between the Rio Grande and the Arkansas. I have hunted and lived over the country. I lived like my fathers before me. And like them, I lived happily. Paruawasamen, Comanche Nation, 1867. The arid land west of the 100th meridian in North America was not created for the faint-hearted. The wet and fertile eastern plains, or the deciduous forests beyond the Mississippi River, is where the ordinary belong. That's the place for those of typical human nature. If you're a regular sort, the kind of person who wants a comfortable life and certainty of a modest level of prosperity and peace, stay out east where the land suits you. Here, in the West, it takes a special sort to even survive, and a truly extraordinary sort to call it home. This is the High Plains, the arid and oft-forsaken country that sees less than 20 inches of rain a year. An early agent of the government of the United States, hoping to assess the land acquired from the French Empire by President Jefferson in 1803, called it almost wholly unfit for cultivation, and of course, uninhabitable by a people depending upon agriculture for their subsistence. His name was Stephen Harriman Long, and he was from another world altogether. Born in Merrimack County, New Hampshire, before the Constitution of the United States was even drafted, Long did what any young, reasonably privileged New England boy of the time would do. He went to Dartmouth, taught school in Pennsylvania, used his education to do some good by young boys growing up in his young country. Then, in 1814, when the British invaded and President Madison called people like him to service, Long answered the call. He was both handy and college educated, so they commissioned him a second lieutenant in the Army Corps of Engineers. He helped build new defenses for New York Harbor when it was feared the British might invade. After the war, he was appointed as a professor at West Point and eventually became one of the leading topographical engineers in the Army. Stephen Long's life is the story of a revolution. Not the one he was born at the end of, mind you, but one that was far more consequential. This man was born in a rural town of less than 2,000 people in 1784. 40 years later, he led the team that carved a path through the mountains to build one of the greatest engineering works of the 19th century, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. From a town whose roads were nothing but compacted dirt, Stephen Long grew up to build roads out of iron. But before he did that, he did something else that would have been thought impossible at the time of his birth. He went west. President James Monroe and the Army sent Long to Yellowstone in 1818. They even made him design a special steamboat to reach it, which of course he did. But it was his second journey west in 1820 to explore the arid grasslands at the far edge of the Louisiana Purchase land that would make him truly famous. He described the land in perhaps the most illustrative terms of all. He called it the Great American Desert. When he arrived on the high plains, Stephen H. Long was practically an alien. Of course, a man like him, a rich, white army officer from New Hampshire, would see this land as unsuitable for his people. But for another nation, it was the whole of the world, the land on which they had flourished and loved and lived. They called themselves the Numunu, the people. The Spanish colonists in Nuevo Mexico called them Comanches, known to the Anglers as Comanches. Much of the high plains as we now know them, the land that would be subject to the twisting and churning and redepositing of earth in the 1930s, was a part of what the Spanish called Comancheria. As they settled in Santa Fe beginning in 1610, the Spanish would come to know the Comanches and their decorated warriors, whom they called Comancheros, very well. The Comanches weren't the first on the land. They'd migrated south from what's now eastern Wyoming. The Querechos, a band of the Apache Nation, inhabited some of the southern plains prior to their arrival. Long before them, one of the most significant human settlements in the region, perhaps the most significant even to this day, was placed on the Canadian River by a group known only today as the Antelope Creek culture. But by 1770, the Comanches were the dominant group on the high plains. They were called the Lords of the Plains. From the Spanish settlements of Santa Fe, Pecos, and Galisteo to the east, they occupied a vast region, including parts of modern New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Colorado. Their domain stretched from San Antonio and El Paso in the south, north to Otero County, Colorado, on the very edge of the Front Range, and eastward into Indian Territory, what you know today as eastern Oklahoma. A change came to the plains in 1821 with the independence of the Republic of Mexico, and even more in the 1830s when another independent republic, the Republic of Texas, was declared. The Texans claimed much of Comancheria, far too much if you ask the Comanches themselves. Of all the settlers and colonists who came to their land, it was the Texans with whom the Comanches were most in conflict. The Texas Rangers, founded in the 1840s, made war on them from the start. In fact, they were openly established to do so. It was their purpose. Both sides fought and won and lost battles over several decades. They kept fighting when Texas became a part of the United States, and even when Mexico lost all of the plains in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Soon after, the United States tore itself apart over the question of whether those in Texas and other southern states would be permitted to continue the barbarous and inhuman practice of race-based chattel slavery. Amidst that war, which was quite literally fought all around the Comanches, hostilities lessened. But after it was over, the Americans came back to the plains. The Comanches called the land to the west of the 100th meridian El Llano Estacado, the Staked Plains, a name which either came from the escarpments that defined the landscape or from the stakes driven into the ground to break up its featureless and downright eerie flatness. In 1867, the United States federal government signed a treaty with the Comanches and other indigenous nations of the plains. The Kiowa, Comanche, and Plains Apache nations all signed the Medicine Lodge Treaty, which granted them rights to live in the Llano Estacado, where no white settlers, at least according to the federal government, would ever want to tread. The Homestead Act of 1862 saw millions rush into the eastern plains. But in the West, it seemed, the indigenous people of the land might still live free. Parua Wasamen, also called 10 Bears, a leader among the Comanche and a signatory to the treaty, saw matters differently. If the Texans had kept out of my country, there might have been peace. But that which you now say we must live on is too small. The Texans have taken away the places where the grass grew the thickest and the timber was the best. Had we kept that, we might have done the things you ask, but it's too late. The white man has the country which we loved, and we only wish to wander on the prairie until we die. Any good thing you say to me shall not be forgotten. I shall carry it as near to my heart as my children. I want no blood upon my land to stain the grass. I want it all clear and pure, and I wish it so that all who go through among my people may find peace when they come in, and leave it when they go out. These were prophetic words. For in just 5 years after the signing of the Medicine Lodge Treaty, the Texans would violate its terms and go hunting and exploiting in the protected lands in the West. The Texans felt the land had been theirs since their independence, not something for Washington to give away. They began to hunt bison by the millions. They used their bones as fertilizer and shipped their hides and meat from Dodge City via the new railways back east. The bison had been everything to the Comanches. They provided fabric and food alike. And now they were being hunted to extinction with the express purpose of extinguishing native resistance along with them. These violations and the natural reluctance of Native people to enter the reservation system led to conflicts with the Texans. These culminated in the Red River War of 1874 and 1875, waged by Quanah Parker, among others. Parker was what would be called mestizo here in California and across the Hispanophone world. His father was a Comanche, his mother an Anglo named Cynthia Ann Parker. Cynthia was kidnapped at age 9 from a fort in Texas and assimilated into the Comanche culture. When she was kidnapped back 24 years later, she was devastated. She spoke poor English and was, in all senses, a part of Comanche society, but the Texas Rangers would not let her go back. They killed her husband and brought her back to an Anglo town, where she lived 10 more years before her death in 1871. Quanah Parker knew the atrocities of the Texans firsthand, and he would fight to preserve his home and his way of life. His opponent in the war was the former Union Army General Philip Sheridan. He'd fought to free the slaves in the East, and now fought to subjugate the indigenous people of the West. Parker and his allies attacked an Anglo settlement at Adobe Walls in the Texas Panhandle, the heart of the Llano Estacado. But on the upper Washita River in late 1874, the Comanches were defeated. Then, at Palo Duro Canyon near Amarillo, the army defeated the Comanches again, killed their horses, and with them, their livelihoods. The lords of the plains were permanently dismounted and soon folded into the reservation system after they surrendered. They were moved into the Indian Territory to the north, leaving the southern plains devoid of their native inhabitants. Soon after, bison hunting reached a fever pitch. By the end of the 1870s, it was nearing its end. 60 million American bison were killed on the plains in the 19th century by Anglos, largely as a strategy for defeating native peoples. In 1890, there were only around 500 bison left. Quanah Parker moved onto the reservation and emerged as a political leader due to his half-Anglo heritage. He eventually hunted with Theodore Roosevelt, rode in his inaugural parade, and amassed a fortune of his own in ranching. But his way of life, and that of his ancestors, was gone by 1880. And what would replace it? The exploitation of the landscape. Exploitation the like of which would lead to its absolute devastation. Having driven the people and animals that once called the Llano Estacado home out of the land, it would now be up to the Anglos to destroy the Llano Estacado all by themselves. Part 2. A Paradise of Grass, 1880 to 1917. The whole country was dry enough most of the time that we could strike a match and drop it and set the whole country on fire. Alan Wilbanks, rancher, circa 1900. The High Plains was a paradise of grass only, man. It could turn miserable in a moment and leave you without a landmark in any direction. Cordia Sloan Duke and Joe B. France, 6,000 miles of fence, life on the XIT Ranch of Texas, 1961. Everything's bigger in Texas, they say. May not always be true, but it definitely is when it comes to cattle ranching. You've seen westerns, you've learned the history. In the late 19th century, round about the time the Comanches were driven onto the reservations in Oklahoma, cattle ranching was the lifeblood of the West. There were two kinds of settlers, ranchers and nesters, those who came to work the herds and those who came to work the land. In the High Plains before the 20th century, it was the former group who predominated. And the largest of the ranches, the largest in the whole of North America, was the XIT. In 1876, the state of Texas wrote a new constitution, and with it expressed their desire for a new Capitol building, the biggest in the country. Polished red granite would be stacked higher than ever before for the purpose in the city of Austin. The only problem was it would cost millions to build. That's over 100 million in today's dollars. The state didn't have that kind of money. I mean, nobody in Texas did. So they put out a call. 3 million acres on the High Plains would go to any company who agreed to build them their capital. It was the Farwell brothers of Chicago, funded mostly by British investors who ultimately took up the challenge. In exchange for building the Texas State Capitol, a project that ended up costing them $3.2 million, or nearly $107 million in 2025 dollars, the syndicate, led by the Farwell brothers, was granted 3 million acres across 10 counties in the Texas Panhandle, the heart of Querecho country, and then Comancheria. It's said the name XIT is an abbreviation of the phrase 10 in Texas, a reference to the 10 counties that this massive ranch, the largest in history, spanned. This was a myth, a story that the cowboys told. In reality, the name was chosen because the letters were easy to brand and hard to obscure. They were simple, the kind of thing that a rustler would have to add to in such obvious ways that theft would be less common. The XIT was a company backed largely by British investment, not just enterprising speculators, but peers of the realm, the Earl of Aberdeen, Baron Thurlow, and the Marquess of Tweedale among them. Leading Tories in the United Kingdom poured money onto the plains in the late 19th century because they felt it was a guarantee of good returns. It was a magical place, the kind of land that could grow anything for as long as you would ever conceive of wanting. Or at least that was true of the fertile eastern plains. In the West, British investors were after something different: the grass. Buffalo grass is a miracle of nature. It's the kind of thing Darwin would have made a career on if it weren't for those finches down in the Galapagos that caught his eye first. A perfect evolutionary case study. The buffalo grass was nature's solution to millennia of the winds that came sweeping down the plain. See, most grass needs water to grow. I mean, it's a plant after all. But the buffalo grass is perfectly adapted to its environment. Give it more than 30 inches of rain a year, and it'll start to die off from over-moisturization. Its roots extend deep into the ground and trap whatever moisture does fall. Early nesters on the high plains describe digging down and still finding wet earth a foot underneath the surface. And most of all, it held the topsoil in place. The sand and sod that made the prairies was liable to blow away at any moment. This was windswept country, but the buffalo grass held it all together. After the Comanches were forced out and the buffalo slaughtered, there was a sea of grass over literally hundreds of millions of acres, with not a soul or a bison around. It was a cow's paradise. At least it seemed that way. And so the XIT brought 150,000 head of cattle onto the land. There were 7 divisions, with as many as 30 cowboys to a division in the high season. The central headquarters of the company was in Channing, over in Hartley County. But plenty of other hubs sprang up on the edges of the ranch, where the meat was shipped back east. Among them was a crossroads town, where the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railway met the Fort Worth and Denver City. One line went east to Kansas, and the other north to Colorado. The town was also at the crossroads of 2 counties, Dallam and Hartley. That's how they named it. They called it Dalhart. Dalhart, Texas. Now, believe it or not, even with 3 million acres and 150,000 head of cattle, the XIT never turned a profit, not even for 1 year. Cattle just weren't well adjusted to the high plains. Like I said, this place is for extraordinary creatures. You know what's an extraordinary creature? The American bison. They could survive the coldest of winters and the driest of droughts. They, like the grass that bears their name, are perfectly suited by natural selection to the environment of the arid southwestern plains. In the mid-1880s, the ranchers found that out the hard way, when the coldest of winters on the plains in living memory killed off nearly all the cattle in the region. Legend has it that animals stretched across the plains for hundreds of miles, obscuring the grass they once ate. You could walk clear from no man's land in Oklahoma all the way to New Mexico without once touching the ground, one cowboy told it. Let's just say I wasn't exactly eager to look for evidence to substantiate that particular claim, so I'll leave it at that. With ranching having proved a bust, the XIT needed another way to make money. That's how they became the largest real estate holding company on the High Plains. They began to market their land to those down on their luck, no matter where they came from. The XIT didn't have a high opinion of non-whites, but even they were candidates for sale in some places. They put up advertisements back east and in the downtrodden parts of Central and Eastern Europe. Some agents would sell to anyone. Others demanded that the so-called Anglo-Saxon race be the ones to settle the land. All in all, this was about making money for those British investors any way they could. If the cattle couldn't survive, the land was all they had left to sell. It was their fundamental asset. Trouble was, of course, this was the arid southwestern plains. It was hard to live there, hard to grow things there. The minimum rainfall level to sustain a crop in the high plains is 22 inches. Back east, it was just 15. But while the east got twice or thrice that amount easily in a growing season, The High Plains were lucky to break 20 in a given year. So they needed to do some pretty creative advertising to get families or fortune seekers to think they could actually make a go of it in the Texas Panhandle, eastern New Mexico, Oklahoma's no man's land, the Colorado Plains, or the arid grasslands west of liberal Kansas. They set up experiment farms, little patches of land to prove that cultivation was possible in this climate. They'd pay for anyone's train journey out to the High Plains so they could take a look at it. The ride onto the plains was free. The ride off? Not so much. You can already imagine, I'm sure, the kind of people these offers attracted. The most down on their luck, most dreadfully impacted by the panic of 1893 to 97. It was people who needed something from the land, who came to the land. If they had resources or had just gotten lucky, most farmers had already claimed a piece of the Mississippi or Missouri valleys, or perhaps some of eastern Oklahoma in the land run of 1889, the year of the Sooners. It was for those with nothing left, those for whom the land was the last hope of a decent future, that the XIT was for sale. And that's who bought most of it. At first, mostly rich speculators gobbled up the land at $1 an acre from the XIT Corporation. Among them was William Pulver Soch, a U.S. Marshal from Iowa who bought up 30,000 acres to build the town of Ware, Texas. He called the High Plains an empire in the making. That's how he sold it to his customers. Another champion of the region was Hardy Webster Campbell, cultivator of the Northern Plains, who had developed methods for soil cultivation west of the 100th meridian and became an apostle for farming in this dry country. His book, Campbell's Soil Culture Manual, first printed in 1902, was the companion of most of the sodbusters who came to the area. It promised plowing techniques that could increase the productivity of this arid landscape. Now, Campbell preached some decent dryland farming techniques, but he also included plenty of soaring promises about the prosperity sodbusters were sure to experience. Not exactly false advertising, but unsubstantiated claims, I guess we'd call them today. Campbell, though, was far from the worst. Railroad companies and land speculators had a saying: rain follows the plow. Rain follows the plow, they said. Just show up, dig up the grass, plant your crop, broom corn, wheat, whatever. And then be sure to raise some livestock and you'd be guaranteed a profit. Why, you'd have to be the village idiot to fail at it. It was that simple. I mean, think about it. They said that farming itself, just the process of farming, would bring rain. What Stephen Long had called a land wholly unsuitable for cultivation was now being sold as a place where anyone could plant anything and it would grow. The old XIT cowpokes knew the whole thing was daft, but no nester was ever going to listen to a cowboy. Up in the Oklahoma Panhandle, the counties of Beaver, Texas, and Cimarron, even more advertising misdeeds were afoot. At the very center of Cimarron County, an outfit called the Southwestern Immigration and Development Company started selling lots in a dream town, the kind of place where they said every man is a landlord. $45 was all it cost to own a piece of this paradise. There were trees, an elegant set of paved streets, upscale shops, stately homes, a good school. It was perfect. The Irvine of the High Plains. Turned out it was all a lie. People took the free train ride out there, and what did they find? I swear to God, a bunch of sticks in the ground. Lot numbers. Little places to start building. A sea of grass with nothing. They arrested the developers for fraud. They went to prison. But more than 1,000 people found themselves out there in no man's land with no other recourse than to find a way back to the east at their own expense, or just make a go of it. So they stayed, and the fake town, a fraudulent city named for trees that did not exist, became the county seat of Cimarron County, Oklahoma. Boise City, established 1908. The mostly Anglo settlers coming to the High Plains in the first decade of the 20th century weren't alone. After Oklahoma became a state in 1907 and New Mexico in 1912, even more people came. The biggest group, apart from the Anglos from the east, were the Russlanddeutsche, the Russia Germans. They'd migrated into the area surrounding the Volga River in the 18th century because Catherine the Great had promised them new homes there. She swore if they came and settled the land, farmed it, defended it, that she would ensure they were never conscripted for service in the Russian Imperial Army and permitted to practice their own beliefs. That promise was kept throughout much of Russia's history, but as the First World War approached in Europe, many Russia Germans were increasingly villainized. Russian nationalism swept the country, and soon enough, Tsar Nicholas II took back his predecessor's promise. Fearing they would be sent to die in a war against their fellow ethnic Germans, and more importantly, to die for a nation that didn't really accept them, many packed their bags and headed for the Americas. Some 300,000 lived on the Great Plains in homesteads by the time of the Great Depression, with plenty on the High Plains. They were joined by other immigrants, Italian Americans, Polish Americans, and others from European communities not included in the Anglo-Saxon conceptions of the Anglo-American elite. All these immigrants were empowered by the Congress's expansion of the Homestead Act in 1908, when they increased the allowable homestead size to 320 acres, half a square mile. A family could get a full 640, a square mile, called a section. For those from the poorest places in industrial Europe, former serfs in Russia, factory workers in the tenements and urban slums of the American East Coast, the High Plains were a miracle. They could do what John L. O'Sullivan had encouraged the Anglos to do decades before. Go west. Go west and grow up with the country. Now, it was their turn. Plenty of people on the High Plains, though, were there before the Americans arrived. The Comanches and Querechos were driven out, but some of mixed descent, and a larger group of pastores, Mexican shepherds who made a living grazing sheep on the grasslands of the region, lived in the area. To them, this land had been home for centuries, since the days of Francisco Vázquez de Coronado. Their ancestors had come to Nuevo Mexico before the United States even existed, and they were here to stay. By the 20th century, many lived in Cimarron County, Oklahoma, as well as in New Mexico. One of the most notable was Juan Cruz Lujan, who raised sheep on the land as Anglos streamed into Boise City. He and his wife Virginia watched as they began to tear up the grass, the only thing holding the soil to the land. It was what they and their sheep depended on, and these newcomers were just tearing it up, like one would tear into a piece of bread at the breakfast table. Why did they do it? They were told that tearing up the sod would allow crops to grow in numbers beyond their imagining. They were told that this land would provide for them and for their descendants for generations. This was all the land left in the West, and they were told it could be theirs. It was fraud, plain and simple. But for those for whom the land was the last best hope, it wasn't that they didn't know any better. They couldn't afford to know any better. Part 3. The Bonanza, 1917 to 1931. The soil is the one indestructible, immutable asset that the nation possesses. It is the one resource that cannot be exhausted, that cannot be used up. Milton Whitney, Chief of the Bureau of Soils. To prepare the ground as well as we may, to sow our seeds, to cultivate and care for, that is our part. Yet how difficult it is for some of us to learn that the results we must leave to the great silent, unseen forces of nature, whether the crop be corn or character. Caroline Henderson, Spring, 1914. Caroline Agnes Boa Henderson was an extraordinary woman, the kind they write plays about. Born in Wisconsin in 1877, she grew up on a prosperous and successful farm in Iowa, a child of the first Homestead Act in the wake of the Civil War. Caroline was special, and her parents knew it. That's why they did something altogether atypical for the time, especially for an Iowa farm girl. They sent her to Mount Holyoke College in the East, one of the great Seven Sisters women's colleges. Even at school, though, her classmates voted her the most likely to go west and live out on a ranch. Caroline belonged under open skies, in wide open spaces. After teaching school in Iowa for a few years after graduation, she was determined to go. In 1907, the year of Oklahoma statehood, Caroline was one of the first homesteaders to come to Texas County, part of a remote region on the High Plains in what they call no man's land. Even today, fewer than 30,000 people live in the Oklahoma Panhandle, in a state of over 4 million residents. But Caroline saw something in the sod and soil, something of her future, the dream she had harbored since she was a little girl to call a piece of land her own. A year later, she hired a local cowboy to dig a well on her property, and then she married him. His name was Will Henderson, and together they'd have a daughter, Eleanor, in 1909. Caroline and Will were some of the many people who came to the Southern Plains in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. They were searching for the salvation we've heard all about. They were dreamers and dead-enders, people who had no other choice and people who wouldn't rather be anywhere else. Towns like Guyman, Boise City, Dalhart, Lamar, and others sprang up between 1907 and 1917. In the decade between Oklahoma's statehood and the entry of the United States into the First World War, thousands came, each taking advantage of the expanded Homestead Act to get their section of land and begin to plow it up. They broke the grass and they planted wheat, barley, broomcorn, cotton, and maize. For all the Russia Germans, Anglos like Caroline, and European immigrants from the East, there were also black families fleeing Jim Crow and segregation in the South. They established all-black towns, 13 of them at least in Oklahoma, of which Boley is the most famous. There were also Latina migrants, mostly Mexican pastores or farmers from elsewhere across the frontier, who came to seize the opportunity of what was fast becoming a bonanza. In the 1910s, mechanized plows came onto the plains for the first time in history. With a horse or mule-drawn plow, it took almost 60 hours of work to plant and eventually harvest an acre of land. With the coming of the tractor in the 1910s, it could take as few as 3 hours to tear up an acre of the grassland and plant it with wheat or broomcorn or millet or maize. I mean, could you blame the fortune seekers? It was just so easy. For the Hendersons in Eva, or for Fred Folkers and William Lucas in Boyce City, or for Dr. John Dawson in Dalhart, who felt farming was a better bet than practicing medicine in these boom times. The equation was simple. Tearing up the ground equaled a prosperous future. And not just for themselves, but remember, for their children and families. It wasn't greed at first. It was survival. But then in 1917, things got even better for the homesteaders, and circumstances drove even more grass to be turned and more land to be plowed up. On April the 2nd, 1917, the United States entered the Great War on the side of the Allies. Since the Ottoman Empire had blockaded Russian grain shipments to Western Europe 3 years earlier, the threat of a grain shortage in London or Paris was increasingly viewed with concern. But now that the United States was in the fight, the Allies hoped American wheat could solve their supply problem. President Wilson answered that call and signed Executive Order 2769-A that very August. Soon after, a successful business magnate turned public servant was named chairman of the new United States Food Administration. His name was Herbert Hoover. Hoover's administration was tasked with supplying American doughboys and their European allies with enough food to feed several armies. He offered all sorts of incentives to American farmers to grow more wheat, but lots of them already had crops in the ground and committed land. On the southern plains, though, there was so much unturned grassland, and so Hoover hit upon an idea. He would guarantee the price of wheat to incentivize High Plains farmers to grow more. Grow more wheat, he told them. Wheat will win the war. Posters with that slogan went up all over no man's land, the Texas Panhandle, western Kansas, and eastern Colorado. Wheat will win the war. And then there was the fact that the price was righter than ever. In 1910, wheat went for about 80 cents a bushel. It was common in those days to produce 15 to 20 bushels an acre, so you'd be looking at a gross of just under $6,000 on a half section. Very respectable, especially if you just arrived when the drought of the 1890s and early 1900s was resolving. In 1917, though, Hoover and the government promised $2 a bushel. It was an unthinkable price, one that would let those who were just trying to survive a few years earlier become richer than most Americans. By 1920, William Carley Lucas and his daughter Hazel were making 8 times the salary of a factory worker on their section outside Boyce City. Others were doing as much as 40 bushels an acre. The wheat bonanza was well and truly underway. 1914 was the peak year for homesteading on the High Plains, with over 50,000 claims made to at least a half section that year alone. During the bonanza, even though the number of claims went down, the rate of grassland turnover actually increased. Through the war and into the Roaring Twenties, the nesters, like the Hendersons, Lucases, and Folkers, were joined by what came to be called suitcase farmers. They came out on the trains for more prosperous and advantageous land in the east, often from cities, actually. Every winter, they'd come out on the train and spend a week in the High Plains, tearing up a few acres they'd bought and planting it with red winter wheat. Then in the summer, they'd come back and harvest it, turn a healthy profit, and go back to the city once again. That's how much Hoover's price guarantee changed the region. People were able to come in on the train and do wheat farming as a pastime to earn some extra cash. It was a lot of extra cash, come to think of it, but Hoover had turned turning grassland over and planting wheat into a side hustle. And even when the price guarantee expired at the end of the Food Administration in 1920, the boom times kept going. It was the Roaring Twenties, after all. a time when demand, demand, and more demand was practically the national motto. And so more and more people came to the plains with each passing year. In 1926, Ida Watkins, a farmer from Haskell County, Kansas, nicknamed the Wheat Queen by the New York Times, allegedly made $75,000 in profit on her 2,000 acres. It was more money than the president made that year. The prosperity ushered in by the bonanza had visible effects all across the region. Electric lights went up in town. Horse-drawn wagons and carts were replaced by shiny Model T Fords. Fred Folkers bought his daughter Faye a piano for her 10th birthday. It cost $300. $10 down payment and then $10 a month. Buy now, pay later isn't that new, you know. It was a way of life in the 1920s. Installments were paid on everything: cars, tractors, homes, even musical instruments. Department stores also sprang up across the region as high fashion came to the High Plains. In the space of a generation, people who had begun as landless, prospectless wanderers gained access to genuine upper-middle-class wealth. For their children, people like Hazel Lucas, Eleanor Henderson, or Faye Folkers, these plains really were the land of milk and honey. They had known nothing but this prosperity. Nothing but the bonanza. There are a lot of words that one could use to describe this spree of wheat cultivation. Binge is one that comes to mind. You see, with each passing year, more and more of the grassland was turned over. It was plowed up, and before you knew it, the natural carpet holding the land in place was gone. By 1931, it is estimated that 80 million acres of grassland had been turned. Some people cautioned against it, mostly former ex-IT cowpokes or Mexican families who had lived in the area for generations. But again, it wasn't like these nesters were setting out to destroy the ecosystem. They wanted, at least at first, to feed their families and provide for their futures. That's what motivated thousands of homesteaders across the High Plains. But year after year, they turned more grass. How couldn't they? If you planted the wheat, they'd bring you the cash. It was that simple. It's almost like they made it too easy. Amidst the boom times, families who had moved to the High Plains and lived originally in small dugouts, literally homes dug into the native sod of the area, came to build nice houses for themselves. Caroline Henderson and her husband Will added a second story to theirs. These people traded mule plows for John Deeres, carriages for automobiles, hunger for food, for hunger for more land. In the final years of the 1920s, plowing exploded in intensity. More suitcase farmers came as news spread of easy riches on the High Plains. The railroad reached Boise City in 1925, and from then on, even in Caroline Henderson's little pocket of no man's land, people from the great cities of the East would hire locals to run tractors over even more of the grassland. In the final 4 years of the Roaring Twenties, an area the size of the state of New Hampshire was plowed up in Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas. Out in Colorado, Calvin Craybill's father ran John Deere's and later Caterpillars over the land on behalf of homesteaders and suitcase farmers alike. A few towns over, in Lamar, the seat of Baca County, Louise Walton and her husband Stephen Clark welcomed a baby girl in 1928. Her name was Jean. Louise had found herself on the stage as a young girl. It was in movement and not in words that she felt she could fully express herself. She followed that dream of dance to New York City, where she made it big. She was cast in a Broadway hit in 1907. And then she got sick. The industrial air of turn-of-the-century Manhattan was too much for her lungs. So the doctors gave her a choice. Stay here and pursue your dream and probably die. Or go west, where the air is free and fresh. So Louise Walton took a train to Baca County, Colorado in 1908. That's where she met Stephen, a local rancher. And that's where her daughter was born 20 years later. They too turned over the grass as Louise began to work on a new dream, to build a home for herself and her daughter in this far western country. Back in no man's land, Caroline Henderson did not have the kindest of words for the suitcase farmers that now streamed into Boise City. These insurance agents, preachers, real estate men, and so forth from cities near and far have bet thousands of dollars upon rain, have hired the preparation of large areas of land all around us, which no longer represent the idea of homes at all, but just parts of a potential factory for the low-cost production of wheat. If it rains. If it rains became something of a motto on the high plains when Caroline had arrived. Prior to the Great War, there had been a drought that killed off many of the first homesteaders' crops. But in the 1920s, nature played a cruel trick on the nesters. She gave the land its wettest decade in recorded history. A place that a century earlier had been so arid as to be judged unfit for agriculture, received well in excess of its precipitation averages for as many as 15 years running. Now, it's easy for us to look back and say that was a statistical fluke. It was bad timing. We know how variance catches up, whether it's rain or blackjack or baseball. But remember, these people didn't have the National Weather Service or meteorological charts or really even a good weather system in general. They hadn't even lived on the land long enough to know what the dry years were like. All they knew was rain follows the plow. I mean, maybe it was true, as far as they could see anyway. Amidst the bonanza, one man in Cimarron County, Oklahoma, bought a square mile of land for each of his 5 children. His name was Harry Forrester, and he leveraged his home and farm and all of the progress on his dream for the last 22 years to buy those 5 square miles. He wasn't the only one who did it. The land would soon practically all be bought up. You had to get in on it while you could. A few miles away on the Lujan Ranch, Juan Cruz and Virginia despaired at what was happening to the landscape. Sure, they had a nice new church for themselves and their ranch hands made possible by the boom. They benefited to an extent, but they knew the land. Their parents had known the land. They knew that one year or another it would stop raining, and the land would suffer. As long as the crops grew, no one minded the occasional sandstorm. In this land of high winds, it was even to be expected. And as far as the concerns back east, well, that was half a continent away. There were new wealth opportunities on the high plains, and that was all that mattered. In Boise City, the Palace Theater showed the first film ever to feature synchronized dialogue in 1927. In Dalhart, the number 126 Club ran all hours of the night for its cash-rich patrons. The Mission Theater was built there in stunning Spanish Revival style. It was the new Santa Fe. Seafood was even getting shipped into town via rail from Galveston for customers who could now afford it. It seemed, in the autumn of 1929, as if the boom would never end. The second largest ecosystem on the continent, one of the world's greatest grasslands, had finally emerged into its fullest form. In 1929, 2,000 acres a day were plowed up across the southern plains. The soil, as Milton Whitney had written on behalf of the government at the beginning of the decade, was an inexhaustible asset. So too, they hoped, would the good times be inexhaustible. On October 24th and 29th, 1929, the American stock market experienced the worst collapse in its history. Over the next several weeks, $35 billion in shareholder value disappeared, 10 times the budget of the United States federal government in that year. Only 3% of Americans owned stock, so for most on the High Plains, this was a news story rather than a calamity. People held out hope that it was merely a correction. The economy had gotten a little intense over the last few years, so maybe it just needed a reset. But the nation was what financial professionals call over-leveraged. People had bought stock on the back of other stock, taking out massive loans that were all called in and seemingly all at once. Things got much worse, much more quickly than anyone had expected. In 1930, the price of wheat, which had boomed consistently above $1 a bushel throughout the bonanza, fell below that critical threshold. One man in Dalhart was promised by his banker that the price would never fall below 95 cents. The next day, it fell by 50%. The price hit a low of 60 cents a bushel that December, down from the $2 it had been during the Great War, and that's not even accounting for inflation over that same period. At first, farmers did the only thing they could to ensure a profit. They planted more wheat to keep up their margins by economies of scale. This resulted in the turning of even more grass in 1930 and 1931, as farmers desperately attempted to ensure the continuance of their lifestyles by tearing up more ground. At the same time, the first generation of homesteaders were aging, and now their children's generation were themselves taking up homesteading, resulting in even more land being stripped of its natural grasses. Among those children of the second generation were Hazel Lucas and her new husband, Charlie Shaw, whom she'd fallen for at a football game in Boise City some years earlier. Hazel took to teaching at a local school, but because of the Depression, all they could offer her for payment were IOUs. By 1931, 8 million Americans were out of work, a 16% unemployment rate. Within less than 2 years of the Wall Street crash, the financial system was frozen. No one could borrow and no one could save. Most of the farmers had some extra cash lying around from the boom times, and with their land being owned outright, and of course growing more wheat to respond to the price crash, they hadn't yet felt the earthquake that those in the centers of industry had. In Chicago, for instance, as many as 40% of people were out of a job. But many in the High Plains felt that this was an Eastern problem. Many homesteaders on the High Plains, though, had lost their savings. In Dalhart, people banged on the doors of the local bank, screaming, "Open up!" to no avail. Banks failed all across the country. And because at the time there was no deposit insurance, working folks in communities all around the continent who had done the prudent thing and put their money in the bank to earn interest lost everything. Suddenly, farmers started missing their payments on their cars and equipment. Fred Folkers had trouble keeping up with his piano loan for Faye. In late 1931, the largest wheat crop ever harvested in any nation or any period upon the earth in its long history of agriculture was sent out to market. No one could afford to buy it. The farmers' short-sighted survival tactic, planting even more wheat to ensure a healthy margin, crashed the price even further. Supply was higher than at any point in history, and demand was lower than anyone could remember. It was a recipe for disaster. In 1917, it had cost roughly 35 cents to grow a bushel of wheat. By 1931, with a combination of inflation, but also much higher equipment costs and larger farms, that number had gone as high as 80 cents in certain cases and hovered around the average of 60 to 75 cents. The price per bushel at the start of the Depression halved from $1.20 to 60 cents. But in 1931, amidst the record crop, high supply pushed it down to as low as 30 or even 25 cents a bushel, less than half of what it cost to grow. It was, simply, a catastrophe. The following winter, most of the record-breaking crop of the previous year was put into grain elevators or just laid out on the plains, gathering dust, quite literally. In some cases, it was burned en masse to drop the price artificially. Some attempted to appeal to President Hoover for aid, but he was reluctant to involve the government. The market, he figured, was the best agent to govern the price of wheat. Tragically, a philosophy he did not hold a decade earlier. The market was now killing the prospects of these families. Many blamed Hoover, others blamed God. Most didn't have time to blame anyone. They were too busy trying to survive. The great wheat bonanza was over. Some felt a better year was just around the bend. They were next year people, after all. But one man in Texas saw it differently. Bam White was one of the last cowboys on the high plains. In 1926, he brought his family, including his young son Melt, down from Kansas, where he had worked some of the last herds to graze the grasslands. He wanted his horses to get him to Amarillo. He would speak to his horses. He would speak to the land. His wagon got across Kansas and then Oklahoma, but one of his horses died in the night in the Texas Panhandle. Another died the next day. Bam White took it as a sign. He would give up the cowboy's life and settle down with his wife and son there at the crossroads where his wagon had broken down. It was just outside of Dalhart. The Whites raised turnips and potatoes on their land, not wheat. Bam knew these were the right kind of crops. Root vegetables were best in the grasslands because they could soak up the moisture beneath without disturbing the topsoil so much. Bam White was half Apache and half Anglo. His ancestors had called this land home even before the Comanches. Though he was ashamed of his indigenous heritage, believing, like so many Anglos of his time, that it was a thing to be regretted and hidden, he was always conscious of the land in a way that the suitcase farmers and homesteaders were not. He was not the land, but he was of it. In late 1931, Bam and his son Melt were out amongst the grass. They walked about the homesteads and the farms. Bam looked troubled. Melt asked him why. He turned to his son and he said, "Look what they done to the land. Wrong side up." Part 4. A Sorrow That Can't Talk. 1932 to 1935. You're buying years of work, toil in the sun. You're buying a sorrow that can't talk. But watch it, mister. There's a premium goes with this pile of junk and the bay horses. So beautiful. A packet of bitterness to grow in your house and to flower someday. We could have saved you, but you cut us down, and soon you will be cut down, and there'll be none of us left to save you. John Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath. In 1928, a man named Hugh Hammond Bennett, working for the Department of Agriculture at the time, published a report that garnered little notice from anyone. It was called Soil Erosion, a National Menace, and it warned that if the exploitation of the topsoil across the nation, including in the High Plains, were not arrested, it would lead to reduced crop yields at best, or ecological devastation at worst. Now, what devastation meant in each region was very different. In the East, it meant oversaturation and the washing away of the soil amidst intense rainfall. In California, it meant the displacement of natural soils in river deltas and avoiding runoff into the Pacific. But on the High Plains, Hugh Bennett warned of something very specific. Unless the homesteaders adopted dryland farming techniques, their soil would blow away. The land they cultivated would cease to be attached to the earth, and without terrace farming, a dryland technique that could help the soil artificially hold itself in place, there would soon be more dirt than air in the sky. There are no terraces in this region, Bennett lamented. The farmers do not even know what they are. In the early 1930s, Hugh Bennett's prophecy came true. The topsoil of the High Plains washed over the land in some of the most terrifying storms ever witnessed, as decades of injudicious cultivation, as one historian called it, were paid for in the space of a few of the hardest years anyone had ever known. It began as a curiosity. In January of 1932, a cloud of dust 10,000 feet high appeared outside Amarillo, the largest city in the Texas Panhandle, and in the whole of the Southern Plains. By noon, it swept over no man's land, reducing visibility to a quarter mile or less and depositing topsoil across the landscape. The local weathermen had no idea what was happening. They called it spectacular, in that old sense of a literal spectacle. They get much more precise in their descriptions as dusters became commonplace. 14 severe dust and sandstorms hit the High Plains in 1932. With each, mere minutes of warning would send children and parents alike running out to get the chickens inside or make sure younger siblings weren't caught out when the duster hit. Crops that had gone in the ground earlier that winter were drowned not by rain, as was the custom of the last 15 years, but by dunes of dust and sand. Most crops failed, and the farmers were powerless to stop the storms from coming. As more crops failed, more soil was freed to blow across the plains, only to be deposited somewhere else and kicked up again when the next winds came. The first 12-hour storm struck in the summertime of 1932. It left families inside all day bundled together for shelter. Amidst the storm, a woman in no man's land went into labor and gave birth to twin boys. Roy and Troy McCoy, they were called. The twins were exposed to fine particles in the dust that their vulnerable neonatal immune system simply could not handle. With no natural defenses, they didn't have a chance. There wasn't a hospital in Boise City. Even if there were, the family couldn't see their own front porch, let alone into town. Roy and Troy McCoy died after 12 hours of life. They were buried in 2 shoeboxes purchased from the local general store the next day. Their family was left with nothing but their tears. At Caroline Henderson's home in Eva, Oklahoma, the family had cut back on all their non-essentials. They disconnected their telephone, bought just a few years earlier. Their trips into town to the grocer's got less frequent. They weren't alone. Soon, those who ran businesses in town struggled to stay afloat. Store owners who 5 years earlier were taking special orders from California or France on behalf of their newly wealthy neighbors were now close to failing. The operators of the Palace Theater in Boise City announced their closure due to poor profits, but reopened after the personal appeals of residents that the pictures were all they had in these dark times. The Plains economy was built on the homesteads, and now the bottom was falling out for everyone. Others in eastern Oklahoma, mostly sharecroppers who had come to work land bought by conglomerates or seized by banks during past busts, were thrown off the land, as corporate boards voted to mechanize their farms and throw the tenants to the curb. The landless, hungry, and migrating eastern Okies soon passed through the Texas Panhandle and eastern New Mexico and witnessed for themselves how things were no better on the other side of the 100th meridian. Most kept going, headed for the one place where dreams still seemed to come true: California. The majority, however, unwilling to give up the land that they had worked and fought for, provided they owned it outright and could remain, stayed behind. They'd rather be failed owners than hopeless migrants on the road like those from the east. In Scott City, Kansas, the sky darkened at midday in 1933. For days on end, it was a perpetual night, broken only by the occasional glimpse of a small white sphere that they once called the sun. It was now barely a nightlight. The crops of 1932 had failed across the high plains. Wheat was sold now for 20 cents a bushel. The farmers would quite literally be better off if they hadn't planted the crops at all. Still, these were next year people. They planted more wheat in 1933 because they hoped that things would improve. Again, most of them weren't around for previous droughts. Most had only known the boom times. To paraphrase a popular song of the day and the soundtrack for a certain presidential campaign, maybe happy days were soon to be here again. The opposite was true for Harry Forrester, the man who had bought 5 sections, one for each of his sons, in 1928. He lost the land to a prior claimant in a lawsuit and then was forced out of his own home when he missed his mortgage payments. There were hundreds like him up and down the former Llano Estacado. They'd either lost their savings or never had any in the first place. When they were pulling money out of the ground just a few years earlier, many didn't even think to plan for a rainy, or in this case, dusty, day. Amidst the deprivations of 1932 and 1933, when 50 severe dust storms ravaged the high plains in the space of just 2 years, plenty of people came west, peddling solutions. A doctor came to Boise City and diagnosed Fred Folkers with a tumor he didn't even have. She made him pay for a drug that was even less useful than a placebo. And just like that, some of what little the Folkers family had saved left town on a train, never to be seen again. Politicians came too. The governor of Oklahoma, William H. Murray, nicknamed Alfalfa Bill, told the people of his state that it was immigrants, people of color, and most often Jewish residents who were responsible for their troubles. He wanted to deport Jewish Americans to Madagascar, and he advocated for segregationist policies to be enshrined in the Oklahoma state constitution. These proposals went nowhere, but not because the other white officials weren't sympathetic to Alfalfa Bill's policies. In 1932, he promised the people a guarantee to the 4 Bs in his campaign for the presidency of the United States. Every American, Murray said, was entitled to bread, butter, bacon, and beans. He received few votes outside of the Oklahoma delegation, at that year's Democratic National Convention. The man who received the most votes, and whom Murray personally loathed, was an aristocratic former Attorney General of New York and Assistant Secretary of the Navy by the name of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Alfalfa Bill called him every name in the book, accused him of all manner of sins and infidelities. But the people of the High Plains were buying what Roosevelt was selling. Most of them were traditional Republicans, but when Roosevelt came west talking about jobs guarantees and how the government needed to step in and fix the mess that they'd caused on the Southern Plains, people flocked to the polls to vote for him. Roosevelt won nearly 74% of the vote in Oklahoma in November of 1932, and he carried no man's land by nearly the same margin. Every county in Oklahoma went blue for Roosevelt. As the new president headed to Washington to begin providing, in his own words, a new deal for the American people, Caroline Henderson headed to a neighbor's homestead to offer assistance amidst the hard times. "We spent Thanksgiving Day trying to help a sorely afflicted family," she wrote to a friend. 5 of the children were down at once with typhoid fever in a family who had already lost their stock, truck, car, tractor, and some say now their farm. 1 boy had already died, and 2 girls since. Such utter lack of everything to make life decent or endurable, I hope you have never seen. Yet, as Christmas neared, Caroline and Will were hopeful to welcome back their daughter Eleanor, now aged 24, for the holidays. "If only we had her at home," they said. "I think we should feel rich in spite of all the disappointments of this most depressing and distressing year." Caroline didn't vote for Roosevelt, she confessed in a letter to a friend. "I can only hope," she wrote, "that he may do better than I believe he is capable of doing." She would later acknowledge that he did so. Perhaps the most consequential thing President Roosevelt did for the people of the High Plains was appoint our old friend Hugh Hammond Bennett to head a new agency, the Soil Conservation Service. Big Hugh, as the locals called him, was a savant of agriculture. Born on a plantation in the Carolinas in the 1880s, he had come to know agricultural science better than anyone. But he wasn't just an intellectual. As historian Timothy Egan put it, he could talk cotton in the South, wheat in Kansas, and oranges in California. Bennett excoriated the farmers in his writings for what they had done to the grassland. In perhaps his most famous quote, he declared, "Americans have been the greatest destroyers of land of any race or people, barbaric or civilized." He called for a great national awakening and a complete 180 on agricultural policy on the High Plains. As Bennett got to work implementing dryland farming techniques, others proposed even more drastic solutions. Reverse homesteading was among the most terrifying ones offered in the halls of Congress. It would involve the federal government paying nesters who had come to the plains with a dream to go practically anywhere else, returning the land to its natural condition after years of agriculture. Roosevelt felt this was a retreat, something that would render the last 4 decades a great waste of human endeavor. And yet, Hugh Bennett was unsure that too little too late could really save the plains. He was convinced that in the long term, the region must return to its original use patterns, grasslands fed upon by herbivores who were in turn fed upon by humans. That was how it was for the Querechos and the Comanches, and that was how it was during the XIT days. If food was to grow here, it would be like Bam White's turnips, holding the ground in place as the winds blew, and not like wheat. To Bennett's satisfaction, no one could grow anything anyway in 1933 and 1934. In 1933, not a drop of rain was reported until August in parts of no man's land. By then, it was nearly harvest time. What crops were planted were either picked up by the dust, killed in a bitter frost that left the whole region barren, or eaten by desperate cattle clinging to life in a landscape that was never intended for them in the best of times. Of course, the other big crop killers were the insects. Grasshoppers and locusts had lived on the plains for millennia, but had found balance with the grassland and the bison. Like the rest of the ecosystem, they were disturbed by the great plow-up of the teens and 20s, but now they were being blown about the land as never before. Dusters would pick them up at one end of the prairie and whisk them to the other so that no crop was safe. They ended up in chimneys, on storefronts, and covering windows such that light could scarce get through. These were plagues, many felt, of biblical proportions. In Dalhart, a religious revival was held in 1934 that claimed that decades of drink, card playing, and prostitution on the prairies were to blame for all of it. Others, like Caroline Henderson, felt that avarice and inattention to nature were at fault. Federal prohibition ended in 1933, bringing some economic life back to the cities on the plains. Liquor was one thing that seemed to be in everyone's budget, and beginning later that new year, government work was available that gave more people opportunities to purchase it. Grocers and saloon keepers were helped by the measure, but some counties remained dry. Still, when the president visited the southern plains, he was greeted by a sign that said, "You gave us beer, now give us rain." In a year of no moisture, water was far more precious than alcohol. Beer, the president admitted, was the easy part. Rain would remain scarce on the high plains for the next 5 years, but families up and down the region held out hope that it would come any day now. As one farmer's son remembered it, the land held beauty between the dusters. The clouds hung preciously, and though most hoped them to be rain clouds, they were only signs of what once was. The earth would give again, but not this year, and not the next. When a duster was coming, you'd notice something before the mountain of soil, sometimes 100 or more miles across. Static electricity filled the air. People would carry metal rods or chains in their cars to ground the electricity so it didn't short out their equipment. You couldn't touch anyone, some remembered, unless you wanted to get shocked something fierce. The electricity discharged on gardens and groves, killing the vegetables and fruits families grew just to feed themselves. Subsistence was the only option left for some, many of whom went into increasing levels of debt or sold off much of the material wealth they had accumulated over the boom years. In an inverse process to the decade prior, they exchanged mechanical equipment for older and cheaper models, had cars repossessed, and in some cases, lost their homesteads altogether. To make ends meet, Caroline Henderson wrote for Ladies' World and The Atlantic. That's the reason we have so much of her writing today. In 1935, she pursued a master's degree in English literature and wrote a thesis about relationships to the soil in literatures across different periods. It was perhaps the perfect project for a woman who had lived in such close relation to the soil through its prosperity, destruction, and now demise for the better part of 30 years. Caroline's daughter Eleanor pursued a master's of her own at the University of Kansas and eventually became a medical doctor. And talking of doctors, they were in short supply on the high plains. Dust particles, micrometers in size, were just small enough to enter the lungs of those who breathed them. People ate dust, breathed dust, and drank dust. Over and over again, as Timothy Egan made his way through the high plains to research his 2006 history of the Dust Bowl, those who survived and remained on the land told him that the only place in the house that wouldn't be covered in dust when they'd wake up in the morning is the spot on the pillow where their heads laid. People would set the table with the plates and glasses upside down. Even then, they'd wash the glasses and plates before eating. Some still washed glasses out before drinking until the day they died over 80 years later. For all the care they took, though, for all the sheets over the windows changed twice daily, washed and then dusted and then washed again, many got sick. The dust pneumonia was yet another plague that came onto the prairie in the 1930s. It was the result of lungs filled with small particles of dust until they could simply no longer expel it. Children, in particular, would cough through the day and night. Amidst 24-hour dust storms, they'd hack up dirt in their parents' homes. The land their parents had staked their fortunes on was now inside of their children, killing them from the inside out. They'd turned the land wrong side up, and now it was getting its revenge. With the dust pneumonia, though, it wasn't just coughing. The dust settled into the alveoli of the lungs and literally stopped the cilia from naturally clearing the pleural lining. No death rates are officially reported, but rates over 50% in children have been suggested. Deaths by pulmonary failure in Kansas increased 120% during the Dust Bowl, and hospital admissions spiked from 1933 to 1935. It wasn't just people, either. Cows were found with lungs filled with dust, dead on the prairies from literally suffocating to death in the open air. Coyotes would have suffered the same fate had not the farmers killed most of them over the preceding years to protect their cattle. As a result, the coyotes' natural prey, the jackrabbits, now ran rampant over the plains, eating what little still grew. To protect their crops, communities organized rabbit drives after church on Sundays. Flyers were hung all around town and newspaper notices advertised the gatherings. Families went together, with children taking turns clubbing as many rabbits to death as they could before handing the club to their siblings to give it a try themselves. For every rabbit they killed, though, all while wearing their Sunday best, there seemed to be 2 or 3 more that emerged from the ground. In 1934, foreclosures reached a record pace as local newspapers, including John McCarty's Dalhart Texan, shifted from cautious optimism to reporting on the latest estate sales and auctions. A doctor in western Kansas committed suicide after losing all his money. No one had cash to pay for his care, even as their children lay in rooms coughing more than they breathed. A similar fate befell Dr. Dawson in Dalhart, who had turned away from medical practice some years earlier and sunk his life savings into the land, which now refused to grow a single crop. A Dr. Wilson in Boise City killed his wife and then himself in a murder-suicide motivated by financial distress. By 1935, the only medical professionals that seemed to be around were either 50 miles apart on the vast expanse of the grassland or Red Cross volunteers staffing relief tents. President Roosevelt sent money, food, and fuel to the plains throughout the mid-1930s, in addition to these charitable volunteers. And as the national unemployment rate reached 25%, nearly a quarter of the people in much of the southern plains relied on government work to get along. One of the most difficult jobs the government offered was forced scarcity enforcer. Under the forced scarcity scheme, the government would artificially decrease the supply of commodities in order to raise the price and help farmers, grocers, or manufacturers actually turn a profit. The most dramatic of the forced scarcity programs was for cattle. The Civil Conservation Corps hired men who were former doctors, lawyers, grocers, bakers, and farmers alike to go around to homesteads across the High Plains and slaughter cattle. For a set fee paid by the government to the homesteaders to offer them some dignified earnings, their cattle were driven into ditches and killed en masse. Children often watched these massacres and shared their painful memories well into their adult lives. In one instance, a little girl begged a government agent to let her keep a dairy cow she loved, but the agent was powerless to permit it, telling her it wasn't up to him. The girl watched as the cow was shot and killed. Some farmers did the killing themselves, others let the hired hands do it. The government also incentivized farmers not to grow wheat, paying them to let their fields grow fallow. In May of 1934, a dust storm from the northern plains of the Dakotas, Wyoming, and Nebraska blew east with the jet stream for some 350 million tons of prairie dirt to be scattered across the east. The streetlights in Manhattan came on at noontime, as drivers refused to go outside for fear of killing innocent pedestrians on the roads. In Washington, D.C., the National Mall and the pristine white marble of government buildings were covered in topsoil from 2,000 miles away. Ships as far out into the Atlantic as 300 miles offshore had dust from the Great Plains fall on their exteriors. In response, many in the East blamed the homesteaders on the prairies for the entire affair. East Coast papers proposed strange and often demeaning solutions to the crisis, including paving the whole of the High Plains with concrete or asphalt to hold the ground in place, or even more amusingly, taking every wrecked or junked car east of the Mississippi and tying them down to the prairie to weigh down the land. Even though that one eastbound duster was the most noticed given the high population affected, those in the geographic center of the dust storm outbreak, No Man's Land, the northern Texas Panhandle, and southwestern Kansas, faced far worse on a near daily basis at points in 1934. Some rain did fall later in the year, and matters even began to look up for a time, but it was a temporary reprieve. Snow and dust mixed over the winter. Frost came as it always did, but the water didn't stay in the ground. The land was bone dry and the soil was eroding. Even when there was no snow in the storms, they were called black blizzards by many who lived through them. Authorities warned people not to go out alone and to abandon their vehicles if they got stuck and climb out lest they be buried and die within their cars with no one noticing. Fence posts that had been in the ground for 20 years were buried by drifts of soil when they weren't being chewed upon by rabbits or grasshoppers or desperate cows. A century earlier, the Llano Estacado was marked by the Comanches' wooden stakes driven into the ground to guide them home. Now the homesteaders' fences replicated those stakes, and some of them even used them to navigate home when caught out in a storm. Louise Walton's daughter, Jean Clark, was one of those kids. She loved to play and run. The land was wide and welcoming to her, except when it turned black. One day in 1935, Jean was caught outside as a duster approached. Before Louise could go and find her, dust swarmed over their home in Baca County, Colorado. Jean couldn't see the hand right in front of her face. She was rescued, but began coughing soon after. Her fever soared over 104 degrees. Finally, Louise took her to the only doctor nearby who diagnosed her with the dust pneumonia. Louise Walton had abandoned her dream and come to Colorado for the air to heal her industrial-age lung ailment. Now her daughter, in whom she had invested those dreams after abandoning her first loves of dancing and the stage, was now being choked by the once therapeutic atmosphere in the land where the columbines grow. Louise Walton had come here for the air. It was now killing her daughter. To the southwest, Hazel Lucas Shaw entered labor in New Mexico after fleeing Cimarron County to keep her baby away from the dusters. Her husband Charlie navigated sand drifts and more dusters just to see her, and finally stumbled in from the road just as their daughter, Ruth Nell Shaw, came into the world. After a while, doctors said it was safe to return to Oklahoma. They did so at the time when the dusters reached their peak. Dodge City, Kansas had only 13 days without a dust storm in 1935. It was little better in Cimarron County. That spring, more dust entered the lungs of those living in the high plains. Children went to school with masks on. The Red Cross urged people to wear them, but there weren't even enough to go around. Those who couldn't afford medical care, or for whom no medical professional could be found, rubbed kerosene or turpentine on their chests and drank a cough syrup made of diluted kerosene to ease their suffering. In an echo of what would happen in England during the war 5 years later, children were shipped east to relatives just to save their lives. Some were not so lucky. 9 children died in Liberal, Kansas of the dust pneumonia in 1935. It was the same story in almost every county on the High Plains. Hospitals covered the floors of public buildings, and doctors drove children to mortuaries in the backs of their cars after visits to faraway homesteads. In 1935, Hazel Lucas Shaw, whose grandmother had come to the High Plains at the turn of the 20th century, faced the most painful experience that a human being could imagine. She and her husband Charlie, who had met amidst the boom times, owned the mortuary now in Boise City, Oklahoma. They lived with death in the mid-1930s. It was their profession. They knew the pain that other families had experienced. It's part of the reason why they determined that their daughter, Ruth Nell Shaw, would be born away from the dusters. But in the spring of 1935, Hazel's grandmother, the original homesteader, was afflicted with the dust pneumonia. She was over 80, and this land to which she had migrated in her youth, that had seen her from a hopeful girl to an old woman of property and a large family, was now killing her. The land entered her lungs, and that spring, it took her last breath. But as it stole her last, it stole some of her granddaughter's very firsts. Because Ruth Nell Shaw had also come down with the dust pneumonia. Just a few hours later, Ruth Nell died. And so, the ultimate next-year girl, Hazel Lucas Shaw, prepared to bury her grandmother and her daughter on the same day, April 14th, 1935. The day was Palm Sunday. The Shaws headed for Enid in central Oklahoma. They could not bury Ruth Nell in Boise City, their home since they were children, because of the cemetery's dust-ridden condition. One couldn't be sure if a body was already buried on a plot or not. Hazel's grandmother was to be returned to her own homestead in Texhoma to rest, finally, on the land she had loved. That afternoon, though, from the north came the largest, blackest, and most devastating duster the plains had ever seen. The morning was beautiful. The land was still and sunny, and families who had not dared to go outside in weeks past opened their windows and praised God for light and clarity amidst these dark times. Hours later, they ran for shelter. In Beaver County, Oklahoma, a young boy and his sister found their way home together despite not being able to see the road. Trixie Brown's family in Follette, Texas, rode out the storm in their car after being caught out picnicking. There was no light at all that day in the afternoon. The storm rendered the sky darker than the night itself. Charles Shaw, father of the late Ruth Nell and son-in-law to Grandma Lou, crawled on his stomach for miles to ensure he saw his daughter's body into the ground with dignity. It was the worst dust storm anyone had ever seen, a catastrophe the like of which the Bible only contained equivalents. In a shelter in the Texas Panhandle, in a church in Cimarron County, and in communities across the plains, the same refrain was heard. This was the end of the world. God, finally, had seen fit to end the suffering of his children. Woody Guthrie, who lived through what came to be called Black Sunday, said it was as if the Red Sea were coming down to engulf the children of Israel. One of his best-known folk songs, "So Long It's Been Good to Know Ya," was based upon the apocalyptic mood that he heard in a shelter that day. On Black Sunday, 2 generations of Hazel Lucas Shaw's family went into the earth. That same day, the earth went into the lungs of her neighbors and friends who had been caught outside enjoying the finest day on the plains in months. More people would die that summer, and those who lived emerged with pulmonary challenges they would suffer through well into the 21st century in the final years of their lives. Multiple children who caught the dust pneumonia that Palm Sunday did not live to celebrate Easter just 7 days later. Amidst the disaster, Caroline Henderson wrote a letter to the Department of Agriculture in which she reported to them on the extent of the devastation. Yet, in August of 1935, a curious event happened on her homestead as she entered her 29th year on the land. A tractor moving along the ground accidentally caught a stone and pulled it from the soil. It was the cornerstone of her original claim made in the year that Oklahoma became a state, and that the plains were open to possibility. The moment moved Caroline to quote a playwright from 3 centuries earlier, one most famous on the plains and elsewhere for writing the tragedies of Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet. All these many years, that stone has marked the corner of our homestead. It suggested the beauty of the untouched prairie when the surveyors set the stone, the luxuriant thick turf of the native grasses, the pincushion cactuses, straw color and rose, the other wide flowers which in their season fulfill the thought of Shakespeare. The summer's flower is to the summer sweet, though for itself it only live and die. Part 5. What's Left Is Us. 1936 to 1939. Earth hath swallowed all my hopes but she. She's the hopeful lady of my earth. Capulet, Romeo and Juliet, Act 1, Scene 2. The man with words is not the only man who thinks and weeps with the deep question of his being. Let no one ever think himself a part in this. Let him sit down and talk to any man and feel his shame. The unsayable things come out as clear and simple as a bell at night in every word he speaks. He wants more than bread and sleep. He wants himself, a man to wear the dignity of his reason. Sonora Babb, whose names are unknown. In the wake of Black Sunday, 250,000 people from the southern plains migrated to California. Calvin Crabill's father John and Harry Forrester, the man who had bought 5 sections in Cimarron County, were among them. Though they had earlier sworn they would never leave their homes and farms, they did so in increasing numbers as the land simply wore them out. Black Sunday was devastation the like of which only the Bible had words to describe. Throughout the region, you heard things like apocalypse, judgment, and the end of the world. How did they describe our country by contrast? The Garden of Eden, a place of possibility, a wonderland. Painfully, but poetically, these were the words they once used to apply to their own homes before the dusters came. But it wasn't just the farmers and homesteaders. Over half of the migrants weren't farmers. Druggists and undertakers and construction workers alike went west in search of work. Even with thousands employed by the president's New Deal programs throughout the High Plains, there wasn't enough to go around. When they got to California, they faced prejudice and contempt. Okies, they were derisively labeled, even if they had come from Kansas or Texas or Colorado. The Arguello family on their ranch in New Mexico watched many of them pass by on Route 66 as they traveled west. Some never made it out of New Mexico. They were simply stranded by the side of the road and had to make do wherever their automobiles broke down. Migrants came from eastward, too, land that wasn't in the heart of the Dust Bowl but had still suffered from the economic shocks of the crisis. Arkansas farmers, in particular, were highly represented in the westward migrations. When the migrants passed the inspection stations on the California border, they were subjected to derision and discrimination almost to a person. Signs reading "Okie, go home" flew in the wind throughout the Central Valley and the other farming regions. In Tulsa, where I was born, the Californians paid for a sign of their own, telling migrants to turn around. There's no work in California. Migrant labor has always been essential to California agriculture, but as long as the history of migrant labor is here, the history of hatred against those migrants by those living in the area is even longer. Chinese and Japanese orange pickers in the 1880s, Mexican cultivators throughout the 20th century, and now the Okies in the 1930s were derided by Californians for taking their jobs and ruining the integrity of their country. Or so they claimed. Dorothea Lange, a photographer for the government's Farm Security Administration, was a part of the endeavor to document it all. Before the FSA, Lange's agency was called the Resettlement Administration, part of the reverse homesteading scheme that saw farmers deprived of their land settled elsewhere throughout the country. But as the FSA, the goal of the administration wasn't resettlement, but to support migrants and to keep farmers afloat. Lange's photographs were a crucial part of that mission, helping to bring public awareness to the plight of those who took to the road. Lange's most famous photograph, Migrant Mother, depicts an anonymous 32-year-old woman living in a lean-to tent beside the roadway in San Luis Obispo County here in California. She was stranded there and had sold her tires to buy vegetables. Her children hunted birds for food during the day. She may have been 32, but she looked about 50. There were many others like her. Men wandered into downtown Fresno or Modesto or Madera, asking for food to save their wives and children starving in a tent somewhere. Another FSA official seeking to address the crisis was the journalist and poet Sonora Babb. Born in Kansas, Babb grew up on the High Plains in Garden City and came to California in 1929 to work for the Los Angeles Times. When the Times reneged on their employment offer after the crash of the market, though, she faced scarcity. She even slept in a tent in Lafayette Park at the intersection of modern Westlake and Koreatown. Soon, she took to writing, both as a secretary at Warner Brothers in her day job and also for a local radio station. She married a local cinematographer, James Wong Howe, in 1937, though due to California's repugnant anti-miscegenation statute, their marriage would not be recognized until 1948. The next year, Sonora started work for the Farm Security Administration to document the sufferance of those seeking meager agricultural wages in the Central and Imperial Valleys. She met people on the roadsides, in tents on abandoned fields in the San Joaquin Valley, and at rest stops as they commuted north or south looking for more work. Throughout it all, Sonora Bab was convinced that these people had something still, even amidst their deprivations. Dignity was the thing they deserved, and that's what she wrote in her novel about them, which went unpublished after the success of The Grapes of Wrath, but was finally published in 2004. From Oklahoma to California, Woody Guthrie sang about the plight of those he'd found along the roads. His songs came to define both American folk music and left-wing advocacy for jobs and fair labor practices. Others documented the crisis too, including the photographer Arthur Rothstein. It was Robert Geiger, and actually his editor at the Associated Press, who famously coined the term Dust Bowl in his report on the events of Black Sunday. The nation was beginning to awaken to a consciousness of the calamity, but due to Guthrie and Steinbeck's focus on those who fled, those who stayed behind, particularly in the arid southwestern plains, were often left out of popular depictions. Steinbeck's novel, a sensation in the late 1930s rivaled only by the success of Gone with the Wind, received a popular film adaptation in 1940 starring Henry Fonda. Still, The Grapes of Wrath was a story about Eastern sharecroppers fleeing to California, not people like Caroline Henderson or Louise Walton, who remained on the land they had claimed for themselves in the early part of the century. Back on the high plains, then, people felt as abandoned as the drifts of dust that still blanketed the landscape. Mothers made clothes out of grain sacks for their children, and when those manufacturers learned of the practice, they began to print patterns on the sacks so that the dresses made from them would feel more fashionable to young girls. On Bam White's farm in Dalhart, he ground up Russian thistles, better known in this country as tumbleweeds, which were brought to the plains by the Russia Germans 2 decades earlier. He salted and fed them to cattle, and others had to resort to feeding them to their children. Caroline and Will Henderson raised native yucca plants and mesquite, the species that had evolved to grow on the arid plains, and managed to survive and even donate some to neighboring families to keep them afloat. Starvation was not a fear on the high plains, it was a reality. Jackrabbits and what vegetables survived their seemingly relentless appetites helped some, but local stores were stocked with food that no one could afford. If you couldn't grow it, you couldn't buy it. Storekeepers and shipment officers were driven out of business and soon couldn't afford to stock their own shelves. Lard and bread were all that some got for a day's meal. Local women bore the strain of the drought and deprivation more than most. Mothers worried about how they would feed their children that cried nightly for food. One woman, frustrated to her bitter end with not being able to keep the house clean amidst the incessant dusters, took her own life. Other families moved from farm to farm, losing each one when prospects dried up or when they missed rent payments. One family moved once a year for 4 years straight from 1935 to 1939. In Dalhart, Dr. Dawson worked to feed local residents out of his kitchen, even though he too had fallen on hard times. The Hippocratic Oath ran deep. These homesteaders, who had displaced the nomadic plains nations of the pre-conquest era, though, had now become itinerant migrants themselves in order to survive. For those who had enough to stay put, pride was sometimes as great an impediment to survival as scarcity. Families who 10 years earlier had enjoyed an upper-middle-class life for the first time and who engaged in a race to keep up with their neighbors in the acquisition of material wealth now found themselves torn between applying for relief or struggling proudly off the dole. In Beaver County, Oklahoma, one girl recalled the shame she felt as the government relief truck came to her door. She was sorry, she said, that her neighbors had to see they needed that truck to survive. In some cities, the names of those on government relief were printed up in the newspapers. They were Anglos, Germans, Mexicans, all sorts of people, all struggling because of what the U.S. economic and agricultural policy had wrought in what Robert Geiger had called the Dust Bowl of the country. In addition to food and surplus commodities relief, there was the Works Progress Administration, or WPA. It employed 8 million Americans by the end of the 1930s and provided a lifeline to many on the Southern Plains. People who worked for the WPA built infrastructure of all kinds: aqueducts, highways, bridges, schools, and civic buildings. Many, though, felt they had lost what made them who they were, their sense of dignity and self-respect. Caroline Henderson famously remarked that the government would have saved money had they simply paid stipends to every man and woman working for the WPA, but that this could not be achieved in a society such as theirs, where preserving self-respect was paramount. Shame, defeat, and the loss of hope were the most common sentiments on the prairie, it seemed. This land where every man was supposed to be a landlord had become a place where almost no man had even $100 to his name. Their land had died. Some of their children had died, and now it seemed the death of the future had come in full. In this place, the high plains that represented the dream of a generation of the downtrodden, over a third of the population disappeared in the space of 5 years. After a grueling summer in Baca County, Colorado, Ike Austin, a young man who was meant to inherit the farm and the future, walked off his parents' land with nothing but a backpack and a bottle of water to try to find work in town. More dusters blew after Black Sunday and well into 1938. In those years, tens of millions of acres of land entered the sky and were deposited elsewhere. Locals could tell where a duster had come from by the color of the soil. On his desk at the White House, President Roosevelt rubbed a little bit of Oklahoma off his desk before starting work on April 15, 1935. Roosevelt's plans now expanded from simple relief and work programs to help people earn money to actually healing the ecosystem. Though Henry Wallace, Secretary of Agriculture, had advocated resettlement, by 1937 a consensus had built around Hugh Bennett's Project Dust Bowl, run out of Dalhart and Amarillo. The project had 2 principal goals: teach nesters how to use the soil with terracing and one-way plowing to ensure safety, and incentivize them to sign contracts committing acres to a replanting of the natural grass. By 1938, 1 million acres across the southern plains had been contracted for replantation with buffalo grass. Soon, there would be over 20 million acres committed to what Bennett called soil conservation districts, independent authorities charged with cultivating the land as a whole ecosystem and preserving its broader ecological integrity. Human beings had destroyed the grass and then the bison and the people who depended on it, but now Big Hugh Bennett was bringing the grasses back. Terracing and one-way plowing were also augmented by the president's plan to plant trees for the first time on the high plains. This grassland had never hosted trees before, but something needed to hold the soil down. People got Civil Conservation Corps jobs planting trees in Nebraska, Kansas, and even Oklahoma and Texas. Hugh Bennett warned in a speech in 1936 that unless Project Dust Bowl was aggressively pursued, the U.S. would have succeeded in creating a new Sahara on the Great Plains of the Americas. For Bam White, there would be no such restoration of the landscape. He and his children had gone into town to the Mission Theater in Dalhart to see the film The Plow That Broke the Plains, produced by the government to explain the Dust Bowl and the path forward to people across the country. Bam was interviewed in the film, sorrowful and somber at the failure of yet another crop in 1937. The old cowpokes and his Apache ancestors were right. This land was not meant for farming. It was meant for grazing. That's what he told people through the camera. In 1938, another crop failed on Bam's Dalhart farm. The grasshoppers ate everything he had put into the ground. Amidst the cold of February, with little to eat and no shelter but their shack clinging to the panhandle, the White family struggled. One day, Bam White did not get out of bed. He was in pain, and then before anything could be done, he was gone. The last cowboy on the high plains was one of the final victims of the decade of dust and devastation. After 12 years clinging to a farm in Dallam County, Texas, it was over. He had warned his son to let the land not ever get wrong side up again, and the land he and his ancestors had loved now saw him out of this earthly dominion. The frost continued through April in 1938. In the summer, President Roosevelt came to Amarillo to address the nesters and members of the Last Man Club, a group that promised never to leave the High Plains. One of its founding members, Dr. Dawson, who had fed families out of his kitchen, died just before the president's arrival. The largest marching band ever assembled in human history to that point played American patriotic songs as Franklin Delano Roosevelt rode into town in July to speak to those who had placed their trust in him twice at a national election. He reported the success of Hugh Bennett's work, that millions of acres were now set aside for conservation to ensure the land never again blew with the high winds in drought times. Then, just as Roosevelt began his speech to the large crowd, it started to rain. It was a miraculous event, Roosevelt weather, they called it. No one had an umbrella because rain was so rare, especially in summer, so they all ran for cover. But soon the president emerged again and got the crowd cheering louder than ever for the success of the conservation programs. He told them that the people back east just didn't get it. They didn't understand the spirit of the plains nesters, who would never, ever give up. But he did. They were forgotten men and women of America, but he would never forget them. The rains of 1938 portended the floods of the same year, when a deluge hit parts of West Texas and saturated dusted ground until mud was more common than any other element in the area. First, nature had given too little. Now it seemed to be giving too much. But those who now remained stayed on the plains for good. Some joked that only death would take people off the land now. They made it this far, and they were going to keep on keeping on. Caroline Henderson reflected back in 1939 on what had transpired over the last 8 years. So much death and devastation of humans and animals and plants alike. Writing to her friend Rose, Caroline said, "It will take years of favorable seasons and persistent effort to effect any real recovery. We have both worn down fast during the years of extreme desolation since 1931. Every small accomplishment now seems to demand a greater output of energy and resolution than in the years that are gone. But perhaps that is the common experience." That same year, Dr. Eleanor Henderson, progeny of the plains, began her career as an anesthesiologist at the Kansas University Hospital in Kansas City. She would become head of the Department of Anesthesiology in 1941. The Shaws, too, had moved away, but others, including Caroline and Will, carried on as a new decade approached in 1940. "Don't give up," Caroline told her neighbors. "A brighter day will come. Next year. Next year." Epilogue. Between 1931 and 1939, billions of tons of dust blew across the plains and as far as the mid-Atlantic Ocean. The soil of the Querechos and Comanches, of the Mexican Pastores and the XIT Cowboys, of the Whites and Hendersons and Folkers and Austins, It all dissolved into the air. The hopes of at least 3 different generations dissolved with them. For them, it was all what Caroline Henderson had said, a vanishing dream. But in the fall of 1939, rain fell on the high plains. In 1940, wheat was harvested again in larger volumes, this time with much of the surrounding soil committed to conservation to prevent further troubles. Soon, the price of wheat was $4 a bushel as the world went to war again. In the end, it took a second world war to rescue the people of the southern plains, many of whom went right back to bad habits and tore up the trees that President Roosevelt had advocated at the height of the dust crisis. Ike Austin, who had left his family's homestead in Baca County, Colorado, looking for work, found himself in France. On June 6, 1944, Ike landed in Normandy under the command of a general of the same name, General Eisenhower. He was part of an operation to free the people of Europe from the tyranny of the Nazis, an operation that was successful. When he came home, Austin resettled at the heart of his parents' dashed hopes, Baca County, Colorado. He died there in 2007, aged 89. Hazel Lucas Shaw had moved away and died in 2003 at 99 years of age, always dreaming of the good times and the placid air in no man's land. Caroline and Will Henderson worked their farm near Eva, Oklahoma into the 1960s. Finally, when they became too ill to continue, they moved to their daughter's home in Arizona. There, in April 1966, Will Henderson passed away. Caroline never fully realized it. She died a few months later in Arizona, leaving behind her daughter and a grandson. She was 89. On her mother's death, Dr. Eleanor wrote to the friends who had received so many of her mother's letters, documents that would soon prove critical sources for the first histories of her life and that of her neighbors. In closing, Eleanor quoted a Bengali poet. "Death is not the extinguishing of the light. It is putting out the lamp because the dawn has come." Parts of Caroline Henderson's homestead still stick out from the prairie in Texas County, Oklahoma to this very day, nearly 120 years after she first arrived there as a hopeful and bright woman of letters and lover of the land. Alvin Turner ended his edited collection of Caroline's writings with a quote from one of her master's papers, which I will reproduce here. "Is it in vain that the flowers bloom by the edge of the alpine glaciers or on the Siberian meadows, where no one sees their color or enjoys their fragrance? We should be grateful for such flowerings of the spirit of man, both for their own sake and for what they suggest of a beauty unrealized, or even fairer flowers growing abundantly on the higher uplands of individual life." Caroline Henderson lived on those higher uplands of the individual. She was the very essence of the unrealized beauty of those people living at the margins of the world. The sonnet of Shakespeare she quoted, Sonnet 94, has a quatrain all about her. "They rightly do inherit heaven's graces and husband nature's riches from expense. They are the lords and owners of their faces, others but stewards of their excellence." Melt White, the cowboy son of Bam, died in Dalhart, Texas in 2005. The XIT is now memorialized in Dalhart at a museum, and there are meetups routinely to remember the original vision for what the plains might have been in the wake of the conquest. The Comanches do not live on a true reservation, but rather govern sovereign tribal territory near Lawton, Oklahoma. They have not been permitted to return in large numbers to the southern plains that their ancestors called home and took such great care of in the 18th and 19th centuries prior to the devastation of the Great Plow-Up and the Bonanza. When writing his history of the Dust Bowl in 2006, Timothy Egan lamented that there were no bison on the southern plains. But now, 20 years later, there are conservation herds of bison in Colorado and Texas, and even in Oklahoma near the lands of the Comanches. The bison, slowly but surely, are returning, and there are now 31,000 wild bison on the continent, 20,000 of them the plains bison, of which there were only 500 or so left in 1890. What I have offered here is but a fraction of what occurred on the southern plains in the fourth decade of the 20th century. One must bring the narrative to a close at some point, and over 18,000 words just feels right. And yet, there are so many more stories to tell. More in Timothy Egan's The Worst Hard Time, a fantastic narrative history of the period and a source for much of what is here. More in the letters of Caroline Henderson, edited, as I mentioned, by Alvin Turner for the University of Oklahoma Press, quoted extensively in this particular audio documentary. More stories, too, in the writings of Big Hugh Bennett, and more in Pamela Riney Kerberg's foundational histories of the Dust Bowl in Kansas. Riney Kerberg has actually taken issue with much of the doom and gloom sense of the Dust Bowl in other accounts and popular media, noting that for many on the High Plains, this was an especially bad drought, but one they were determined to get through. Endurance and stoicism in the face of the decade's conditions, she wrote, deserve more attention. I hope, despite having foregrounded stories of sufferance in certain cases to provide context, I have not ignored this perspective either. In Vail, Oregon, and Dalhart, Texas, Dust Bowl migrants and enduring residents played baseball against their neighbors. They kept up the traditions. There were games and proms and plays at the local schools. They celebrated Easter within a week of the most devastating storm in their history. Many families hung on, far more than the number that left. In Arizona, a local theater renamed itself after the Dust Bowl, showing motion pictures to residents for whom the moisture on the High Plains was far more than they ever received out among the cacti of the Sonora Desert. Still, the depopulation of the High Plains would never be reversed. Even today, the southwestern plains of North America are among the least densely populated lands on the whole of the earth. Much of what is there are farms propped up by government subsidies that began in the New Deal era. Government reports throughout the late 20th and early 21st century have held that the policies of Hugh Bennett, the soil conservation districts, and others have successfully prevented a recurrence of the Dust Bowl. Dusters still happen in drought times even today, but to nowhere near the same extent. Still, some worry about whether Bennett's solution will hold for another century as we approach the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the crisis in 2031. The Ogallala Aquifer, where irrigation is now drawn from across the High Plains for what farms still exist, is also being depleted at a rapid rate. In Texas, some say that the current rate will not last even a few more years. A University of Texas report in 2025 said as much, and warned that better conservation was necessary to avoid a repeat of either the Dust Bowl or devastation in general. Here we are, nearly a century on from the most devastating artificial disaster in the history of Earth's environment, and we are nearer to repeating that scale of devastation than ever. This history may become our future, and it behooves us, in our lives of relative abundance in the 21st century, to look back on this period for lessons, both on land management and also for the much bigger questions. How do we stay human when the world around us seems to be ending? What's left of us when the land dissolves? How can we manage the death of the future? The show we stage this summer will answer some of these questions as much as it shall recall the travails of the 1930s. Those people have so much to teach us, and they deserve so much better than they got in their time on this earth. Oh, I almost forgot. There's one person I have left to tell you about. Louise Walton refused to leave Colorado, the land she had journeyed to when she gave up on her first dream, when faced with the fear of the dust pneumonia and its effects on her daughter Jean. But in 1935, Jean got better. Louise Walton Clark hung on in the high plains. She did not lose a second dream to the environment. Her daughter Jean grew up and lived a full life in southeastern Colorado near the land her mother had worked in the early 20th century. She was even a professional ice dancer and traveled the world in exhibitions after the Second World War ended. Her mother, Louise, had given up dancing so that she could have a life and so that Jean might one day come into the world. In the 1950s, Jean fulfilled her mother's dancing dream and saw more of the world than her mother ever could. She passed away in March of 2007 in Colorado at the age of 79. Though Caroline Henderson found a reflection of the high plains in Shakespeare's Sonnet 94, it's Sonnet 73 I would like to close with. For all those chronicled here, and for all who escaped mention due to the frailty of my all-too-human mind, I offer this one last song of a faraway place, and one new show from California. May the land be restored, and these people, so much more like us than we realize, be long remembered. That time of year thou mayst in me behold, when yellow leaves, or none, or few, do hang upon these boughs which shake against the cold, bare ruined choirs, where late the sweet birds sang. In me thou seest the twilight of such day as after sunset fadeth in the west, which by and by black night doth take away, death's second self, that seals up all in rest. In me thou seest the glowing of such fire that on the ashes of his youth doth lie, as the deathbed whereon it must expire, consumed with that which it was nourished by. This thou perceiv'st, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well which thou must leave ere long.